Hi and welcome to the FiLMiC channel. What you've just seen was shot entirely on the Sony Xperia Pro I using FiLMiC Pro, and there is something very subtle but so very important that you may have noticed throughout. Can you see it? Motion blur, that beautiful cinematic 180-degree shutter rule at work. In fact, this entire video was shot using an unlocked exposure reticle. In other words, this was shot using auto exposure. So how was a constant 180-degree shutter rule achieved? Well, that is thanks to a brand new feature in FiLMiC Pro on Android that is exclusive to compatible Sony Xperia devices, made possible by our collaboration with the wonderful Xperia team, and that is shutter priority mode. We also offer ISO priority mode on compatible Xperia devices, but in this video we are going to focus on shutter priority as it's the most useful for filmmakers. Why? Because the shutter speed or shutter angle will determine the amount of motion blur in your image, and motion blur is one of the key factors in delivering a filmic aesthetic. In this video we won't go into the history and theory behind shutter angle and how its coupling with frame rate results in motion blur, but we will link to some excellent deep dive explainers in the description field. What we can do quickly, however, is show you the impact that shutter angle has on motion blur. Here is the same scene captured using 4 different shutter angles while shooting at a frame rate of 24 frames per second. You can see that the greater the shutter angle value, the greater the motion blur. And the lower the shutter angle value, the less motion blur you'll get in your shot, to the point that it becomes incredibly jarring and not at all how the human eye naturally renders motion. A shutter angle of 180 degrees is what we as cinema audiences have been conditioned to accept as being cinematic, and typically produces the most pleasing motion blur, hence its popularity amongst filmmakers to this day. Now let's dive in and learn how to use the brand new priority modes. To the left of the medallion, you will now get access to an all-new exposure mode button on compatible Xperia handsets. LV is the default and has powered FiLMiC Pro's exposure system since the app was first launched. It will automatically adjust exposure by adjusting both shutter speed and ISO concurrently, whether you're using the exposure reticle or the manual arc. If you tap the exposure button, you now get 2 new options: ISO priority mode and shutter priority mode. Let's start with shutter priority mode. Tapping shutter priority will let you choose your desired shutter angle. Of course, I want 180-degree shutter, but others are available too. Tap OK to accept. Now that we are in shutter priority mode, the shutter speed or shutter angle is locked, and the ISO will automatically adjust to set proper exposure with our exposure reticle unlocked. This is really great for run and gun shooting, as well as shooting in rapidly changing lighting conditions and even when vlogging. You can now ensure proper exposure and desired motion blur. To the left of the exposure arc, you can see your locked shutter angle, as well as your real-time ISO readout, which will continue to respond to your scene while the exposure reticle is unlocked. This means you can always see what your current ISO value is and identify if it's getting too high to maintain an acceptable amount of noise. You can of course tap the exposure reticle to lock it in shutter priority mode, and now your ISO is locked too. Tap again to unlock ISO. Another great feature of shutter priority mode is that if you reveal the manual exposure arc, not only can you see your shutter speed equivalent, but any manual adjustments made on the arc affect ISO only. If you want to quickly exit shutter priority mode with the arc open, just tap the locked shutter speed value in red and you will revert to the LV exposure system. Now adjusting the exposure arc will adjust shutter and ISO concurrently. Next, let's take a look at ISO priority mode. Tap the exposure button and choose ISO. Now you can select your desired ISO value and tap OK to accept. Now your shutter speed will be automatically adjusted to set proper exposure when the reticle is unlocked, while your ISO value is always maintained. This is useful if low noise is much more important to you than motion blur. Of course, you can lock the exposure reticle, which will lock your current shutter speed value. And if you reveal the manual arc, any adjustments here affect shutter speed only. And once again, if you need to quickly revert back to the LV exposure mode, just tap to unlock the ISO value within the arc. So those were the all-new shutter and ISO priority modes available on compatible Xperia handsets using FiLMiC Pro. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to like, share and subscribe to support the channel. Thanks for watching.